It's the final push for a midterm election stacked with consequence, with time running out until Election Day, Tuesday, November 8th. The candidates hoping to earn a place here in the halls of Congress.
Our ancestors fought for this day.
From local races,
People are just sick and tired of the status quo.
to national implications, including control of the U.S. House and Senate. With races too close to call in Georgia,
This race is about who's ready for Georgia.
I'm here to win the seat for the Georgia people.
Pennsylvania,
Thanks for coming out, everybody.
There are two starkly different candidates.
and Arizona. A look at all sides
I did my research on the candidates themselves.
and every issue facing Americans.
Cannot expect change if we don't voice our opinion.
From the economy to abortion rights.
Our bodies!
Here on Constitution Avenue.
We the people
of the United States.
In order to form a
more perfect
Union.
and establish this
Constitution
for the United States of America.
Hi everyone, I'm Blair Miller. Right now voting is already underway by mail and in person in parts of the country, deciding on congressional leaders and who comes here to represent you. The politicians elected will be tasked with making choices that could impact many of our lives. And for a large number of Americans, issue number one is the economy. Everything from gas prices to interest rates to what you're paying at the grocery store. When it comes to the inflation rate, overall prices rose 8.2% in September compared with a year earlier. Our Chris Heath is in Orlando explaining why this issue is outpacing all the others. It's this week's Article 1.
Good luck to you.
In 1992, Bill Clinton was running for president and looking to define his message. That's when an advisor quipped, "It's the economy, stupid." Now, 30 years later, little has changed.
It is definitely going to be one of the big issues, if not the biggest issue in this midterm, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Dr. Stephen Neely is with the University of South Florida School of Public Affairs, which routinely polls voters on issues and candidates. The top issue, the economy, specifically inflation.
We asked folks, hey, is it going to be primarily pocketbook issues or social policy issues that decide how you vote this November? 74%, 75% said pocketbook issues.
Now, inflation's fine if you don't notice it.
Dr. Michael Binder conducts polls for the University of North Florida. His data shows the same thing, voters viewing the economy not through employment or wages, but through inflation, the cost of the things they buy.
It's yesterday, things were $1 cheaper. That is really when it gets scary, and then people begin to project.
And while inflation is a global issue, that voter projection consistently lands on one place, or in this case, person, the president. So this should guarantee big wins for Republicans. Well, not so fast. Binder and Neely note that partisanship is still the main driving factor. What an issue like inflation tends to do is motivate the base of the party that's out of power and suppress the base of the party that's in power. And in a close election, motivation matters. In Orange County, I'm Christopher Heath for Constitution Avenue.
When you look at the latest polls, there's no question what's driving a majority of Americans. According to Morning Consult, a nonpartisan survey research company, as of October 1st, 77% of voters say the economy is their top issue. Education is next at 54%, followed by gun violence. Then immigration and abortion at 51%. The abortion issue could be a key motivator for women especially. After the decision by the Supreme Court in June, we've seen people marching in cities across the country on both sides of the aisle to bring this issue front and center.
I'm out here today for my daughter's rights, and she needs to be able to do what she wants with her body.
Every one of these children's lives matters, no matter what the circumstances surrounding their conception.
This is the top issue for Democrats right now. For Republicans, they're really trying to keep the focus on the economy. We went through data with the Kaiser Family Foundation. They found 3 in 5 women ages 18 to 59 say the Supreme Court decision is a reason that they will go to the polls on November 8th. Like most midterm elections, the voter turnout will be pivotal. In 2018, the last midterm election, we saw the highest turnout in 40 years. That was 53%, according to the Census Bureau. And this year, people on both sides seem motivated to show up again.
I just think it's most important to get your voice out there and be heard. You can't complain if you don't vote.
Our democracy is under attack right now.
But the group most excited to vote right now may actually surprise you. Pollsters with YouGov estimated that the most enthusiastic demographic is actually Republican men. The poll estimated that more than half of Republican men are consistently saying they will get out and vote this election, and that is higher than previous years. Some states have changed election laws since the presidential election in 2020. In Georgia, the state will have a controversial new voting law in place this November. Critics say it will suppress the vote, while supporters say it will increase voting security. Here's Constitution Avenue's Richard Elliott to break down the changes.
The midterm election in Georgia will be governed by the state's new election law, passed in 2021. To vote in person, voters still need to show an approved form of ID. What's new is ID is also required to request and submit an absentee ballot instead of just a signature match. Another big change, there are now fewer absentee ballot drop boxes than there were in 2020 during the pandemic. And now those drop boxes will be located inside polling places instead of outside. In addition, voters have less time to request an absentee ballot. Critics of the new law say it amounts to voter suppression.
I think it was the intent to make it more difficult for minority community members to exercise their right to vote.
Republicans say the new law improves election security.
They're using the weaponization of election administration again to raise money and create fears that aren't there. The reality is it's a best practice to have an absentee ballot request deadline because people will lose their ability to vote.
Meanwhile, the new law expands early voting in most counties and mandates 2 days of Saturday early voting. Now, one of the most talked about changes in the law has to do with food and water. The law bans giving out food or drinks to voters within 150 feet of the outer edge of a polling place. Republicans say this will prevent campaigns from influencing voters while they're in the line. Democrats say you should be able to give out water, especially to voters in those long lines. In Atlanta, Georgia, I'm Richard Elliott for Constitution Avenue.
In each state, you have races for Congress, and that will have a direct impact on what happens here in Washington. Here's what's on the line. Every seat in the House is up for grabs, all 435 of them. So are 35 U.S. Senate seats. Right now, the Democrats control both chambers with small majorities, but Republicans are poised to challenge that control. Analysts say the president's approval numbers almost always help or hurt the candidates running for House and Senate. Recent polls show President Joe Biden with approval numbers in the low 40 percentage points, very similar to the 2020 approval ratings of former President Donald Trump when Republicans lost 41 seats in the House of Representatives. President Trump has been doing his own part to try and rally supporters across the country, hoping his influence now could help reshape Washington. Let's break this down and show you how the balance of power could shift. It takes 218 seats to win control of the House. Right now, there are 220 Democrats in the House and 212 Republicans. There are also 3 vacancies. In the Senate, Republicans need just a net gain of 1 seat to flip control of the evenly divided chamber. We've been talking with several election experts, and these are the states they're watching closely to see who will control the Senate. Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New Hampshire. Also, the races in Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, and Wisconsin. I spoke with Tom Bevan at Real Clear Politics about what he expects to happen.
Republicans still hold the advantage. They are heavy favorites to get the 5 seats they need to win back control of the House of Representatives. The Senate, there's varying indications as to where that goes. It's going to be very competitive, a lot of toss-up races.
Ahead on Constitution Avenue. The Trump factor. How much influence does the former president really have in the midterms? And will it change the outcome in some races?
We haven't had a president do quite as much as Trump is doing.
And black voters, once considered a lock for the Democrats, but is their support wavering?
Black Democrats are not happy.
Republicans tell us they're trying to take advantage of that. We find out what's being done to make sure the election is safe and the people who oversee it.
I've lost my name and I've lost my reputation.
Protecting workers and protecting your ballot when Constitution Avenue continues. This election, here are some of the races to watch.
I'm Rich Pierce in Pittsburgh, where the big race everybody is talking about is for Senate. Dr. Mehmet Oz continues to narrow the gap between him and Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman. Fetterman, of course, a native son of the Pittsburgh area. The big question now is, do voters think that Fetterman is healthy enough to serve after a stroke in the spring?
I'm Joe Bruno in Charlotte, and you may not realize this, but North Carolina has a high-profile U.S. Senate race. It might not be Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, or Georgia, but the two candidates, Ted Budd, the Republican, and Sherry Beasley, the Democrat, are each polling within the margin of error.
I'm Wendy Corona in Atlanta, where all eyes are on Georgia's U.S. Senate race. It's Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock against Republican Herschel Walker. Walker is a former football standout backed by former President Donald Trump. It's a tight race, and one thing to watch, there is a third candidate in the race, a libertarian, so it could head to a runoff.
Former President Donald Trump is actively campaigning in this year's elections. So what will that so-called Trump factor mean for the midterms? It's this week's Deep Dive, and joining me now are Laura Geller. So Laura, let's start with the basics here. And what are we talking about when we use that term Trump factor?
Well, essentially, we're talking about the former president's influence, how much his presence in the midterm election conversation shapes how people actually vote.
You mentioned that influence. Who exactly is he influencing?
Well, in talking with political scientists, what's interesting here is he isn't only influencing his supporters. They say there are three separate groups to pay attention to. The first, of course, is his supporters, the people who he motivates. Then, on the other side, Democrats, the people who oppose Trump and anyone he endorses might mobilize in the opposite direction. Analysts are also looking at swing voters who could be pushed in either direction by Trump's involvement.
So could this make it harder to predict the outcome of these races?
Well, we asked that question to a political scientist at Georgetown University. He specifically studies political parties and ideologies. He tells me the balance of those three groups will be different across congressional districts, and that is what will ultimately determine the outcome. He also says Trump's influence may or may not change the typical patterns we see in the midterms. Here's some of our conversation.
It's typically the case that incumbent party, the president's party, tends to lose seats in midterm elections. The Trump presence, adding that as a layer, maybe slightly complicates that, because it's not merely how popular is Biden, but how polarized is the electorate, and this may be more polarizing.
Trump endorsed more than 200 Republicans in state and federal races. According to Ballotpedia, about 92% of them won, but it's important to note 3/4 of those were incumbents who were already expected to win. The former president's support came up big in early races with wins in Ohio and Pennsylvania, but there were also some losses in the Georgia governor's race and the Secretary of State's race.
So basically we'll have to see what happens election night.
Exactly.
Laura, thanks so much. And one of the groups that former President Trump has been trying to appeal to is Latino voters. They make up 14% of the voting population, and their vote is important.
At the end of the day, we are being seen as a unity instead of being divided.
It's really about understanding how everything that it involves our lives is impacted by politics.
Across the country, there are more than 32 million eligible black voters. That's according to the latest data from the Pew Research Center. Traditionally, Democrats have counted on black voters to support them. As our Kirsten Garris found, this year, nothing is guaranteed.
As early voting starts nationwide, black voters on both sides of the aisle say the stakes are too high.
When you look at some of those top issues, a lot of that does look like inflation, wages, crime and violence.
Our position in the economic growth of this country, our position in the voting growth of this country.
According to a data analysis by the Associated Press, 9 in 10 black voters chose President Biden in the 2020 election. But recent polling shows Democratic support may be slipping. Data from the Pew Research Center shows about 70% of registered black voters say they would support their Democratic candidate for Congress. Shabomi McCauley, the president of the Westchester Black Women's Political Caucus, believes that may be changing.
Black Democrats are not happy. There's a shift with issues related to the economy, health disparities, the Roe versus Wade, which is big.
The latest research also shows about 24% of those surveyed are either unsure about who to vote for or say they would back another candidate. Some Republicans say they're trying to take advantage of that. The Republican National Committee says it's engaging with minority voters through several community centers nationwide.
But that's a prime example of people actually getting out in these communities and facing the issue head on and first, and really being willing to have the conversation.
Another factor to watch is turnout. The latest data shows Black voters often have higher turnout rates compared to other groups. In Washington, I'm Kirsten Garris for Constitution Avenue.
Ahead on Constitution Avenue, a warning from the FBI and Congress about a spike in threats and harassment against election officials.
These are not just bureaucrats out there. These are our grandmothers, our grandfathers.
Next, we find out what's being done to make sure Election Day is safe for workers and you. Then, voting fraud, the new steps being taken this election to make sure your vote counts. Ahead on Constitution Avenue. Bulletproof glass and new security cameras. That's how some election offices around the country are preparing for the midterm races. It comes as the FBI and members of Congress warn about a spike in threats and harassment against election officials and even some poll workers. Our Samantha Manning explains how the federal government is taking action against these threats and how it may impact your voting experience.
The campaign ads are everywhere.
Pennsylvania needs a conservative.
Send us back to New Jersey.
Reminders of the heated midterm election season. But this year, in addition to the usual political showdowns, there is a new challenge for many election offices. A ramped-up effort to keep poll workers and election officials safe amid a spike in reported threats and harassment.
These are not just bureaucrats out there. These are our grandmothers, our grandfathers.
I spoke one-on-one with Commissioner Thomas Hicks, chairman of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. In response to the growing threat, this year, the commission allowed for federal grants to be used to beef up physical security at election sites and to monitor threats on social media.
That was something that I didn't want to have to do, but it's needed.
Many election officials say the spike in threats stems from the spread of false claims of voter fraud in the 2020 election, and both Democrats and Republicans have been targets. Some county clerks in Colorado have installed bulletproof glass and extra surveillance. In Maricopa County, Arizona, the public can now check out a live video stream of the election site thanks to new security cameras. The Maricopa County recorder, a Republican, wrote this letter to members of Congress about how he received 2 death threats in the days before the August primary. And earlier this year, a mother and daughter from Georgia testified before the House committee investigating the January 6th Capitol attack.
Wishing death upon me. I've lost my name and I've lost my reputation.
Do you expect that this will become the new normal for election cycles, to see this increase in threats?
I hope not.
This spike in threats against election workers has gotten the attention of the federal government's top law enforcement agency. The Justice Department launched a task force last year specifically focused on investigating these kinds of crimes. According to the Justice Department, the task force has reviewed more than 1,000 cases as of August. Around 11% led to criminal investigations. A Texas man was arrested in January, accused of making election-related threats against Georgia government officials. And in October, a Nebraska man was sentenced to 18 months in prison for threatening the Colorado Secretary of State, a Democrat, on Instagram, writing things like, "Your security detail is far too thin and incompetent to protect you." So what do you say to people who still don't trust the system?
Election officials make this very public of the way that the process runs.
Chairman Hicks is hoping that push towards more transparency will help restore the public trust in our elections, so voters can get back to focusing on the candidates.
I've never tired of representing Florida.
I was raised by people who lost their country.
For yet another pivotal election season. In Washington, I'm Samantha Manning for Constitution Avenue.
Georgia is one of several states that received some unwanted attention last election when the former president claimed voter fraud. To date, no fraud that would have changed the results has been found. But as Constitution Avenue's Dave Huddleston reports, there is a heightened focus on ballot security following the 2020 election.
The Georgia Secretary of State's office has prepared for this election for more than a year, and the office walked us through everything that they are doing to protect the integrity of the vote. The Georgia Secretary of State's office is on a mission to show voters the process is secure. State officials tell us all voting equipment is independently checked. Ballots are printed on security paper, and when voters scan their ballots, an image is created and stored on a memory card. In addition, voter ID is required for in-person and absentee ballots. And as part of a new Georgia voting law, absentee ballot drop boxes are now located inside polling places and monitored by an election worker or member of law enforcement. As far as the voting machines themselves, the office maintains they cannot be hacked. Following the 2020 election, President Donald Trump's campaign filed several lawsuits against the Republican-led Secretary of State's office claiming voter fraud. But to date, there has been no evidence of voter fraud that would change the results. In Atlanta, I'm Dave Huddleston for Constitution Avenue.
Next on Constitution Avenue, we hear from Capitol Hill about the extreme political divide.
No one knows better than lawmakers here in Washington that Americans face some pretty tough choices when they do vote. Soon, some new faces will be here. Some current members will lose their fight, and others will return to their job re-elected. We've spent the last few weeks talking with lawmakers here, asking what's at stake this November.
The direction of America, and frankly, just the hope for America continuing to be that land of opportunity is at stake.
My prediction this year is that people will sit back and say, look which party has delivered, look who's on my side.
We've had one party rule for 2 years and it's had disastrous consequences.
I think most voters are going to vote on what's important to them. So they're going to vote on how it impacts them and their families.
The president's approval rating does matter. There's no question about that. The higher it is, the better it is for us. But I will also tell you that we have amazing candidates.
It's not good to see gas prices go up. That's obviously politics 101.
Inflation is the big issue. We're going to need to have a different direction.
We're addressing climate change, inflation, health care.
They're going to vote over inflation and their job and their kids' education.
Prescription drugs, on benefits for veterans.
Inflation is out of control, energy costs more, real wages are down. The Democrats have no plan. We do have a plan.
We've created a commitment to America.
And when it comes to politics, the divide has never been more clear, whether it's here at the nation's capital or back home. The future of America will be decided on November 8th. And while the issues are heavy, so is your vote, which counts and matters. I'm Blair Miller in Washington. Thanks for watching Constitution Avenue.
We the people of the United States. In order to form a more perfect union.
And establish this Constitution
for the United States of America.